Sometimes the things people throw away are the very things carrying the truth. Rain moved across the windshield in slow, uneven lines as Jack Mercer drove the narrow county road leading into Red Hollow, Pennsylvania. Late October had painted the hills in tired shades of brown and fading orange, though tonight the whole town looked washed in cold gray weather instead. Small towns always carried a certain silence after dark, the kind that made old memories feel louder than they really were. Jack had spent most of his adult life learning how to live with silence. 26 years serving as a Navy SEAL had taught him many things. How to stay calm, how to notice details other people missed, how to walk away from places that no longer felt like home. But retirement had taught him something harder. Loneliness sounded different when nobody expected you back. At 57, Jack lived quietly in a small rented cabin 15 miles outside town, near the tree line, where cell signals disappeared and mornings arrived slower. Most days were simple. Coffee before sunrise. Fixing things that did not need fixing. Fishing when the weather allowed. Quiet dinners alone. He told himself he liked peace. Some days he even believed it. Tonight he had only driven into town for dog food. Not for himself. For a neighbor's old Labrador he occasionally checked on while the owner recovered from surgery. Funny thing about kindness. Sometimes it sneaked into your routine before you realized loneliness had made room for it. The storm worsened as Jack turned near Main Street. Rain hit harder now, thick enough to blur headlights into soft, glowing shapes. That was when he saw the sign. Red Hollow County Animal Shelter. Half the front lights were off. Parking lot nearly empty except for one rusted pickup and a county maintenance van. Jack almost drove past. Then something strange caught his eye. A volunteer near the entrance stood holding an umbrella while shaking her head toward an outdoor kennel near the back fence. Someone else walked away carrying an empty leash. Jack slowed without really knowing why. Old instincts rarely disappeared. They simply waited quietly until something felt off. 5 minutes later, he stood beneath cold rain near the shelter office, smelling wet concrete and disinfectant. The young woman behind the desk looked exhausted. Early 20s maybe. Kind face. Tired eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. Jack hesitated. Saw somebody walking away upset. The woman sighed softly. "That happens." She glanced toward the back kennel area. Nobody wanted him. Jack followed her eyes. "Dog?" She nodded. "German Shepherd. Came in almost 3 weeks ago." Her voice softened slightly. "Found near the old mill road." Something about the way she said it felt strange. Like there was more to the story she had decided not to explain. Jack crossed his arms lightly. "Behavior problems?" "No," she said quickly. "Actually, he is one of the calmest dogs we have." Then she hesitated. "People just," she searched for the right words. "He scares them." Jack frowned faintly. "Because he watches people too closely." She gave a tired laugh. "Especially certain people." Before Jack could ask more, she grabbed a flashlight from the counter. "You can see for yourself if you want." Rain followed them outside as they crossed toward the back kennels. Wind moved through old maple trees near the fence, while thunder rolled softly somewhere beyond the hills. Most of the dogs barked the moment they passed. Excited, nervous, restless. But the German Shepherd at the far end stayed completely silent. Jack noticed him immediately. Large frame, but thinner than he should have been. Black and tan coat damp from cold weather. Amber eyes sharp despite obvious exhaustion. The dog stood slowly when Jack approached, but did not bark. Did not growl either. Just watched him carefully. Studied him. Like he had been waiting. "Name?" Jack asked quietly. "We started calling him Ranger," the volunteer said. "Nobody knows his real name." Jack crouched slowly outside the kennel. Years around military dogs had taught him patience mattered. "Hey there," he said softly. Ranger stepped closer, but stopped just short of the fence. Calm. Focused. Strange thing was, he did not look frightened. He looked disappointed. Like somebody had already let him down too many times. Jack noticed old marks around the collar area where fur had worn unevenly. This dog had belonged to someone once. Somebody had cared enough to train him well. Somebody had abandoned him anyway. Why has nobody taken him? Jack asked quietly. The volunteer shifted awkwardly. Honestly, she said. People say he gives them bad feelings. Jack looked back. Bad feelings? She lowered her voice. Every time someone serious about adopting him comes in, he drags them toward town square. Jack almost smiled. Dogs do strange things. Not like this, she said quietly. He sits in front of the old memorial statue and refuses to leave. Before Jack could answer, Ranger suddenly moved closer against the kennel gate. Slowly, carefully. Then something strange happened. The dog looked past Jack's shoulder through the rain toward downtown Red Hollow, visible in the distance. His posture changed instantly. Alert, focused, almost urgent. Then he let out the quietest sound Jack had heard all night. Not fear, not aggression, more like recognition. Jack followed the dog's gaze. Through heavy rain near the center of town, barely visible beneath old streetlights, stood the large stone memorial everyone in Red Hollow knew simply as the Mill Heroes Monument. Ranger never looked away. Rain continued falling across Red Hollow long after most people had gone home. The town square sat nearly empty beneath flickering streetlights while water gathered in shallow puddles along cracked sidewalks. Ranger still had not looked away from the Mill Heroes Monument. Jack Mercer stood beside the kennel quietly studying the dog, hands resting inside the pockets of his weathered jacket. Something about the animal felt strangely familiar, not because of training alone, because Ranger looked like somebody carrying unfinished business. How long has he been doing that? Jack asked softly without taking his eyes off the German Shepherd. The shelter volunteer crossed her arms against the cold. Since the first night. Rain tapped softly against metal fencing around them. Animal control found him near Old Mill Road 3 weeks ago. Hungry. Exhausted. Nobody around. She paused. But every single day, if anyone walks him near town, he pulls straight toward that statue. Jack glanced back toward downtown. Through mist and rain, the memorial stood quiet beneath yellow lights, tall enough to feel important even from a distance. Every town had monuments people stopped seeing after enough years. Familiar things had a way of becoming invisible, and people stopped wanting him because of that. Jack asked. The volunteer sighed softly. Some people said he made them uncomfortable. She lowered her voice. A couple folks actually brought him back after adopting him for a day or two. Jack frowned slightly. Why? Said he cried at night. Her expression shifted uneasily. And if they took him downtown, he just sat there staring at the memorial for hours. Ranger slowly stepped closer again. Close enough now that Jack could see tiredness in the dog's amber eyes. Not aggression. Sadness maybe. Confusion. Like something important had been left unfinished. Jack crouched lower near the kennel gate. You hungry? Ranger blinked once, but barely reacted. Instead, the dog turned again toward the distant town square. Focused. Waiting. Jack had worked beside military dogs years ago. Good dogs had instincts people learned to trust. Sometimes more than other people. Can I walk him? Jack asked suddenly. The volunteer blinked in surprise. Tonight. Jack shrugged lightly. Already wet. 20 minutes later, Ranger walked quietly beside him through downtown Red Hollow beneath cold rain and empty sidewalks. The leash stayed loose the entire time. No pulling. No nervous pacing. Calm. Controlled. Too well trained for abandonment to make much sense. Whoever owned this dog before had spent serious time with him. Jack noticed something else too. Ranger checked corners. Watched reflections in windows. Paid attention to movement the same way trained working dogs often did. Strange for a shelter stray. They finally reached town square. The Mill Heroes Monument stood at the center surrounded by flower beds gone empty for winter. Large stone base. Bronze plaque. Names carved into polished granite beneath an engraved dedication to the victims of the Red Hollow Mill Fire, 1987. Local history. Familiar tragedy. Small towns built identities around stories like that. Ranger stopped immediately, then sat, silent, watching. Rain slid across the bronze surface of the monument, while wind moved fallen leaves through the square. Jack looked down. What is it? Ranger stood again, slowly walked toward the statue, then stopped near the base. Sniffed once, sat back down, still staring, like he expected somebody, or remembered something. Across the street, lights still glowed faintly inside a diner near the courthouse. An elderly woman sat alone by the window watching. Strange thing about small towns. Somebody always noticed when something unusual happened. Jack glanced back at Ranger. You know something, do you? The dog shifted slightly, but never broke focus from the memorial. After several quiet minutes, the diner door opened. The elderly woman stepped outside, holding an umbrella against the rain. Thin frame, silver hair, heavy coat too large for her shoulders. She crossed the street slower than someone used to walking alone. Her eyes moved immediately toward Ranger. Then everything about her expression changed. Not fear exactly. Recognition. "Oh my goodness," she whispered softly. Ranger stood immediately, calm but alert. The woman stopped only a few feet away. Rain tapped softly against her umbrella while silence settled strangely between them. "Where did you find him?" she asked quietly. Jack straightened. "County shelter." Her face lost color. "No," she whispered almost to herself. "That cannot be." Ranger stepped closer to her, but stayed calm. Tail still, eyes steady, like he knew her. The woman lowered her voice. "He looks exactly like Samuel's dog." Jack frowned slightly. "Samuel?" She looked quickly toward the memorial statue, then back toward Ranger. Hesitation crossed her face. The kind people carried when memory hurt. "Samuel Reed," she said softly. "Local reporter." She swallowed hard. "Disappeared 12 years ago." Rain grew heavier around them while town lights reflected across wet pavement. Jack noticed the way she kept glancing toward the memorial. Uncomfortable. Careful. Like old memories sat too close here. "Ma'am," Jack said gently, "you know something about this dog?" Before she answered, Ranger suddenly moved. Fast enough to surprise both of them. The German Shepherd walked directly behind the monument and stopped near the old brick walkway leading toward the shuttered library building. Then he looked back at Jack, waiting. The woman's face turned pale. "Oh no," she whispered quietly. "He remembers." And before we continue, if stories like this pull you in, please remember to like and subscribe so you do not miss more unforgettable stories ahead. Rain softened sometime after midnight, though Red Hollow still carried the damp, heavy quiet that settled over old towns after storms. Streetlights reflected across wet sidewalks while wind moved through empty branches near the courthouse square. Ranger remained frozen near the brick path behind the Mill Heroes Monument, body alert, ears raised, eyes locked toward the shuttered library building ahead. Jack Mercer stood still beside him, watching carefully. 26 years as a Navy SEAL had taught him something simple. When trained dogs focused that hard, there was usually a reason. The elderly woman tightened her coat against the cold and looked suddenly older than before. Rain clung softly to silver strands of hair near her face. "You should not be here," she whispered quietly. Jack glanced toward her. "You keep saying things like that." The woman hesitated. Fear crossed her face too quickly to hide. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said finally. "And if that dog truly belonged to Samuel Reed," she stopped herself. Ranger moved again before she could finish. Slow steps this time. Deliberate. He followed the narrow walkway leading behind the old library where brick walls darkened with age and ivy climbed around shuttered windows. The building looked forgotten. One of those places towns quietly stopped talking about after enough years passed. Jack followed without pulling the leash. Funny thing about trust. Sometimes it arrived before common sense had time to argue. Clara stayed behind at first, but eventually followed slower, glancing nervously over her shoulder as though old habits refused to leave quietly. "Samuel used to come here after hours," she said softly. "Back when the newspaper office still stood open." Jack looked toward the dark library. "What happened to him?" Clara lowered her eyes. "People said he left town." Her voice sounded unconvinced. "I never believed that." Ranger stopped near the far side of the building beside a narrow patch of overgrown dirt hidden between the brick wall and an old drainage pipe. Then he sat, quiet, waiting. Jack crouched beside him. "What is it?" Ranger stood immediately and began scratching gently at the damp ground. Not random digging either. Controlled. Focused. Like he had done it before. Jack studied the area more carefully. Different soil. Slight depression near the wall. Somebody had disturbed this spot long ago. "You have got to be kidding me," he muttered softly. Clara's face changed instantly. Pale. Uneasy. "No," she whispered. "Samuel," Jack looked toward her. "You know something about this?" She shook her head weakly. Only that Samuel trusted nobody near the end. Wind moved softly through empty alleyways while Ranger scratched again. More urgent this time. Jack glanced around until spotting an old maintenance shovel leaning near the back entrance of the library. Probably forgotten years ago. He grabbed it and carefully began moving damp dirt aside. Ranger stepped back, but never stopped watching. The first few inches revealed nothing except roots and soaked leaves. Then metal scraped softly beneath the blade. Jack paused immediately. Clara covered her mouth quietly. "Oh Lord," she whispered. Jack crouched lower and carefully cleared the remaining dirt by hand. A rusted metal box rested beneath the soil wrapped partly in faded waterproof material. Old. Hidden deliberately. Ranger stepped closer but stayed calm. Tail still, eyes fixed on the box like he already knew what sat inside. Jack lifted it carefully. Heavier than expected. Rainwater dripped softly from the edges while cold wind pushed through the alley behind them. "We should not open it here," Clara whispered quickly. "Why not?" Jack asked. She glanced nervously toward downtown. "Because this town notices things." Strange answer. Honest too. Small towns survived on silence better than secrets sometimes. Jack looked at the box again. Rust along the hinges. No lock anymore. Time had taken care of that. Still, something about opening it beside a dark library at 1 in the morning felt wrong. Ranger suddenly looked up toward the street. Alert again. Jack followed his gaze. Across the parking lot near Main Street, headlights slowed. Black SUV. Expensive enough to stand out in a town this size. The vehicle paused longer than normal before moving slowly forward again. Watching. Maybe coincidence. Maybe not. Old instincts rarely trusted coincidence. "Time to go," Jack said quietly. Clara nodded too quickly. "Come to my house." Jack hesitated. "You sure?" Her eyes moved toward Ranger. "If Samuel trusted him," she said softly, "then maybe I should too." 20 minutes later, warm yellow light filled Clara Whitmore's small house near the edge of town. Old books stacked everywhere. Teacups left drying beside the sink. The kind of home loneliness had quietly settled into without fully winning. Ranger finally relaxed near the fireplace, but stayed close to the metal box resting on Clara's kitchen table. Like guarding it mattered. Jack removed his damp coat, slowly while Clara brewed tea with shaking hands. Nobody spoke for a while. Silence sometimes needed room before truth arrived. Finally, Clara sat across from him and looked directly at Ranger. "Samuel Reed had a German shepherd," she said quietly. "Same eyes. Same way of watching people." She swallowed hard. 12 years ago, he started asking questions about the mill fire. Her hands trembled slightly. Then one night, he disappeared. Jack rested both hands against the table. "And nobody looked?" Clara laughed softly, but sadness lived underneath it. "Oh, they pretended to." Her eyes moved toward the rain-dark window. "But around here." She paused carefully. "People prefer comfortable lies." Ranger slowly stood, walked toward the metal box, then placed one paw gently against the lid. The house stayed quiet except for the soft crackle of firewood settling inside Clara Whitmore's old stone fireplace. Outside, rain tapped gently against the kitchen windows while cold wind moved through empty maple branches lining the narrow street. Ranger had not moved from the metal box resting on the kitchen table. One paw still touched the rusted lid as if reminding everyone in the room why they were there. Jack Mercer leaned back slowly in the wooden chair, studying the dog with the same careful attention he once reserved for unfamiliar situations overseas. Something about this did not feel random anymore. Too many pieces already fit too strangely together. Clara wrapped both hands around a cup of tea she had barely touched. Steam drifted upward between them. "Samuel trusted that dog more than most people," she said quietly. "Toward the end especially." Jack glanced toward her. "Toward the end of what?" Clara looked tired suddenly. The kind of tired that belonged to old memories people spent years trying not to revisit. Toward the end of asking questions nobody wanted answered. Ranger lowered his head briefly beside the table, but kept his eyes on the metal box. Waiting. Jack finally reached forward and carefully brushed dirt away from the rusted hinges. "Mind if we stop guessing?" Clara hesitated. Her fingers tightened slightly around the teacup. "I'm not sure I want to know what is inside." Jack gave the smallest nod. Honest answer. But after years in the military, he had learned fear usually arrived long before truth did. Slowly, he lifted the lid. The metal creaked softly with age. Inside sat several water-stained folders wrapped in faded plastic, a bundle of photographs held together with brittle rubber bands, and something unexpected near the bottom. Cassette tapes. Old ones. Carefully labeled in faded handwriting. Ranger stepped closer immediately. Quiet. Focused. Like recognition mattered. Jack picked up one of the folders first. Newspaper clippings. Property maps. Copies of insurance records. Yellowed with age. Some pages marked in red ink. Others circled repeatedly. At first glance, none of it made sense. Then one name appeared over and over again. Bellamy Development Group. Clara noticed immediately. Her face changed. "Oh no," she whispered softly. "No, no." Jack looked up. "You know the name?" She swallowed hard. Mayor Bellamy's father owned half the land around the mill back then. Silence settled again. Outside, headlights passed slowly across the wet road before disappearing into darkness. Small-town traffic. Or maybe not. Jack had spent too many years noticing timing to ignore coincidence. He picked up one of the photographs next. Old black-and-white images of the Red Hollow Mill before the fire. Workers smiling near loading docks. Families gathered during town events. Ordinary moments frozen in time. Then came later photographs. Smoke damage. Construction fencing. Officials standing together. One face appeared repeatedly. A younger Thomas Bellamy standing beside county leaders. Smiling. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. Ears alert. Jack noticed instantly. "What is it?" The German shepherd moved toward the front window. Calm but watchful. Not nervous. Focused. Jack stood quietly and stepped closer to the curtains without fully opening them. Across the street, a dark SUV sat parked near the curb. Engine running. Lights off. Still. Maybe nothing. Maybe somebody lost. But the same vehicle shape looked strangely familiar. Jack remembered the black SUV slowing near the library earlier. Ranger let out the faintest sound deep in his chest. Not aggression. Warning. Jack closed the curtain again without speaking. Clara noticed his expression immediately. "Someone there?" she asked quietly. "Maybe," he answered calmly. He returned to the table and reached for one of the cassette tapes. Faded marker across the label read, "If something happens to me." Clara's hand shook visibly. "Samuel made those near the end," she whispered. "He said if people stopped believing him, eventually somebody honest would listen." Jack studied the tape carefully. "You still have a player?" Clara nodded slowly and stood. "Somewhere." A few minutes later, an old cassette recorder sat humming softly on the kitchen counter. The room suddenly felt smaller somehow. Warmer too. Like truth had entered quietly and nobody knew what to do with it yet. Jack inserted the tape carefully. Static crackled first. Then a tired male voice filled the kitchen. Calm. Measured. Older than expected. "If you are hearing this," the voice said, "then either I finally proved I was wrong." A pause followed. Soft breathing. Or somebody made sure I could not finish. Clara closed her eyes immediately. "Samuel," she whispered. Ranger moved closer to the recorder and slowly lowered himself to the floor beside it. Completely still. Listening. Like he had heard the voice before. The recording continued. "The mill fire story is not true," Samuel said quietly. "People died, yes. But not the way Red Hollow tells it." Papers shifted softly in the background of the recording. Somebody covered up what happened after the fire. Property changed hands too quickly. Insurance money moved too clean. Another pause. "And if I disappear, start with the old library records." Jack exchanged a look with Clara. Neither spoke. Ranger lifted his head suddenly toward the kitchen window again. Outside, headlights slowly pulled away from across the street and disappeared into the rain. Morning arrived quietly over Red Hollow beneath a blanket of low gray clouds and damp October air. Rain had stopped sometime before sunrise, leaving the town washed clean but strangely heavier somehow, as if the streets themselves remembered things people preferred to forget. Inside Clara Whitmore's house, the kitchen still carried the scent of old coffee and fireplace smoke. Nobody had slept much. Ranger had spent most of the night beside the cassette recorder, barely moving except when unfamiliar sounds passed outside. Even now, as pale morning light stretched across the hardwood floor, the German shepherd remained unusually alert. Jack Mercer stood near the kitchen sink staring out toward the narrow road beyond Clara's front porch. Small towns woke slowly. Delivery trucks. Church volunteers opening side doors. Familiar faces carrying ordinary routines. Yet something already felt different. Like invisible attention had quietly shifted toward him overnight. Clara entered wearing a heavy sweater and carrying a small plate of toast neither of them seemed interested in touching. "I almost forgot what nervous feels like," she said softly. Jack glanced toward her. "You afraid?" She gave a tired smile. "No," then she paused honestly. "Maybe a little." Ranger suddenly stood. Ears raised. Focused again. Jack noticed immediately. "What is it?" The dog moved toward the front door, but did not bark. Calm. Intentional. Waiting. Jack opened the door carefully. Cold autumn air drifted inside, carrying the scent of wet leaves. At first, nothing looked unusual. Empty sidewalk. Quiet Street. Then Jack spotted it. A small cardboard package resting near the porch steps. No delivery truck. No footprints visible in damp grass. No return label. Just his name written across the front in black marker. Jack Mercer. Clara stopped behind him. I do not like that, she whispered. Jack crouched slowly. Ranger stood beside him watching closely, but showing no fear. No aggression either. Interesting. If the dog trusted it enough not to react strongly, maybe danger was not immediate. Still, caution came naturally after years in service. Jack carefully brought the package inside and placed it on the kitchen table. Small, lightweight, plain brown cardboard. No postage. No sender information. Just his name. Clara folded her arms tightly. Maybe we should call someone. Jack shook his head gently. Let us know what we are dealing with first. He opened the top carefully. Inside rested a single old photograph and a folded handwritten note. Nothing else. Ranger stepped closer instantly. The photograph showed a younger Samuel Reed standing beside the Mill Heroes Monument nearly 15 years earlier. Beside him sat a German Shepherd. Older, thinner, but unmistakably similar to Ranger. Same alert eyes. Same posture. Same strange stillness. On the back of the photograph someone had written in faded ink. He never stopped waiting. Clara lowered herself slowly into the chair. That is Samuel, she whispered. Her voice sounded far away. And that dog? She looked toward Ranger carefully. My goodness. Jack unfolded the note next. Only one sentence written neatly across the paper. If you want the truth, start where they buried the records. Jack frowned slightly. Library records, he said quietly. Clara nodded slowly. Samuel said the old library. Ranger moved closer again, nose brushing softly against the photograph. Then something changed. Fast enough to notice. He turned sharply toward the hallway leading to the back of the house. Alert. Listening. Jack heard it 2 seconds later. A car slowing outside. Different engine this time. Not the SUV from last night. Ranger remained still near the window, but did not growl. Curious rather than defensive. Jack stepped carefully toward the front room. Outside, a sheriff department cruiser parked along the curb. A woman stepped out. Early 30s. Brown hair tied back neatly. Calm posture. Practical expression. Deputy maybe. She removed her hat before approaching the porch. Ranger relaxed slightly. Interesting again. Dogs notice things faster than people. Clara looked uneasy. Do you know her? Jack asked. Clara nodded carefully. Deputy Emma Collins. A few moments later, Emma stood inside the kitchen holding a warm paper coffee cup from the diner downtown. I figured I would stop by before gossip beat me to it, she said with a tired smile. Her eyes moved briefly toward Ranger. Then the metal box. Then Jack. Observant. Smart. People noticed lights on late, she added gently. And apparently somebody saw you behind the old library. Jack leaned lightly against the counter. Small town. Emma laughed softly. Very. Then her expression shifted. More serious now. Look, she said quietly, lowering her voice. Mayor Bellamy heard somebody has been asking questions about Samuel Reed. Clara looked down immediately. Jack stayed calm. And Emma hesitated. And around here, questions about Samuel usually disappear. Silence settled heavily between them. Ranger slowly walked toward Emma and sat beside her chair. Calm. Watching. She glanced down in surprise. Well, she said softly, scratching gently behind his ear. Guess I passed some kind of test. Then Ranger stood suddenly and moved toward the old photograph again, paw resting carefully beside Samuel's image. Emma's face changed the moment she saw it. Wait, she whispered. I know that statue. Her eyes moved toward Jack. There is something strange about the old records underneath town property storage. She hesitated carefully. And if Samuel left clues, she looked directly at Ranger. Maybe your dog already knows where to look next. By late afternoon, heavy clouds hung low over Red Hollow again, trapping cold air between the hills like the town itself had forgotten how to breathe properly. Clara Whitmore's kitchen felt smaller now, crowded not by people, but by questions. The metal box still rested open across the table beside Samuel Reed's photographs, cassette tapes, and stacks of marked-up property documents. Ranger had barely left Jack Mercer's side all day, though every so often the German Shepherd wandered toward the front window, as if expecting something or someone to arrive. Deputy Emma Collins stood near the stove holding a county records folder she had quietly retrieved from her cruiser. Her expression carried the kind of caution people developed after learning truth often complicated comfortable lives. I checked county property archives before coming here, she said quietly. Nothing official mentions underground storage beneath town square anymore. She paused. But older maintenance records do. Jack looked up from the papers spread before him. Underground storage. Emma nodded slowly. Years ago, before computers, Red Hollow stored legal records underneath the municipal building near the old library. Clara lowered her tea carefully. They shut that space down after the mill fire. Emma hesitated. That is what everybody says. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. Alert again. Not tense. Focused. Jack had begun recognizing the difference. The dog moved toward the kitchen table where the photograph of Samuel Reed rested beside the old mill hero's monument. Slowly, Ranger lowered his nose near the image and nudged the bottom corner. Then he stepped away toward the front door. Waited. Jack exchanged a quiet look with Emma. You thinking what I am thinking? Emma gave a tired smile. Honestly, I stopped trying to explain this dog 3 hours ago. Clara looked uneasy immediately. You are not planning to go downtown right now. Jack glanced toward the darkening sky. Why not? Clara folded her arms tightly. Because people notice things around here. Her voice dropped lower. And lately, they are already noticing you. Strange thing about fear. Sometimes it arrived because danger was real. Sometimes because silence had lived too long in one place. Jack stood slowly and grabbed his jacket. I spent 26 years learning not to ignore instincts. His eyes moved toward Ranger. And this dog has not been wrong yet. 40 minutes later, downtown Red Hollow sat beneath fading daylight and damp sidewalks still slick from yesterday's rain. Shops had begun closing early while warm yellow lights glowed softly behind diner windows. The Mill Heroes Monument stood exactly where Ranger had watched it the night before, quiet beneath bare maple branches moving gently in cold wind. Ranger walked beside Jack without tension in the leash, moving with quiet purpose. Emma parked her cruiser nearby, but left the lights off. Less attention that way. Small towns noticed flashing lights faster than storms. Clara had reluctantly stayed behind, though not before making Jack promise he would call if anything felt wrong. Ranger stopped near the monument immediately. Not at the front this time. Behind it, near the old brick path leading toward the library. Then he moved farther, toward a narrow concrete building attached to what once served as municipal records storage decades ago. Windows boarded. Rust collecting along locked metal doors. Forgotten, or maybe intentionally ignored. Ranger stopped beside the entrance and sat. Waiting. Jack stepped closer to the door. Old lock. Heavy steel. Emma frowned slightly. This place has been shut for years. Jack crouched near the lower frame. Different scratches along the metal. Faint were marks newer than the rest. Somebody had opened this door more recently than expected. Funny thing about abandoned places, Jack said quietly. They do not usually get fresh footprints. Emma looked down immediately. Mud marks near the side entrance. Not many, but recent enough to notice. Ranger moved toward the corner of the building where an old electrical box hung crooked against brick. Then he scratched lightly beside it. Once. Twice. Deliberate. Jack stepped over and noticed something unusual. A loose panel partly hidden behind ivy. Small enough most people would miss it completely. He pulled gently. Inside sat a rusted key attached to faded masking tape. Written across it in old handwriting, City Storage B. Emma stared. No way. Jack looked toward Ranger. The German shepherd remained perfectly calm, tail still, watching like none of this surprised him at all. Samuel left breadcrumbs, Jack said quietly. Emma swallowed hard. Or somebody wanted them found eventually. Wind moved sharply across the square as evening settled deeper around town. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang softly for 6 o'clock. Familiar sound. Ordinary moment. Yet nothing about tonight felt ordinary anymore. Jack unlocked the heavy metal door. Rust groaned loudly before giving way. Cold, stale air drifted upward from darkness below. Concrete stairs disappeared into shadow. Smell of damp paper and forgotten time. Ranger stepped forward immediately, but paused halfway down the first step, turning back once to make sure Jack followed. Like he had done this before, or remembered someone who had. Emma turned on a flashlight slowly. Tell me again how a shelter dog somehow knows hidden county storage. Jack gave the smallest shrug. I stopped asking that question yesterday. The flashlight beam stretched downward into rows of metal shelving barely visible underground. Old boxes. Filing cabinets. Dust untouched for years. At least that was what it looked like at first. Then Jack noticed something near the far end of the basement floor. One section cleaner than the rest. Recently disturbed. Ranger saw it too. Without hesitation, he walked directly toward it. Cold air drifted through the underground storage room carrying the smell of damp paper, rust, and forgotten years. The flashlight beam from Deputy Emma Collins moved slowly across rows of filing cabinets and leaning shelves while shadows stretched unevenly against concrete walls stained by decades of neglect. Ranger walked ahead with quiet certainty, paws moving carefully over dusty floors as though he had followed this path before. Jack Mercer stayed close behind, instincts sharp now. Places like this always carried stories. Some deserved remembering. Others had been buried for reasons people rarely admitted out loud. Ranger stopped near the far corner of the basement beside a row of old metal cabinets marked County Archives. Unlike everything else underground, this section looked strangely disturbed. Dust shifted. Boxes stacked differently. Someone had been here recently. Jack crouched slowly near the floor. Fresh scrape marks. Mud tracked lightly across concrete. Not old. Emma noticed too. Somebody definitely came down here. Her voice lowered instinctively. Not long ago. Ranger stepped toward the lowest cabinet and gently touched it with his nose. Then sat, waiting again. Jack grabbed the metal handle and pulled. Locked. Emma frowned. There should not even be active locks on these anymore. Ranger stood again, calm but focused, then moved 3 feet left toward an old utility shelf partly hidden by stacked maintenance folders. He scratched once against the bottom panel. Deliberate. Jack exchanged another look with Emma. Neither questioned the dog anymore. Funny thing about trust. Eventually, evidence stopped feeling strange and started feeling earned. Jack bent lower. Behind the shelf sat a small recessed compartment built into the wall, nearly invisible beneath years of dust. Old combination lock already broken. Somebody had forced it open once. He pulled gently. The panel shifted with a soft grinding sound. Inside rested a weatherproof storage bag wrapped tightly in plastic. Dry despite the damp basement air. Ranger stepped back immediately after Jack pulled it free, tail still, watching closely like the important part had finally arrived. Emma moved beside him holding the flashlight steady. Tell me that dog is not solving crimes, she said softly. Jack almost smiled despite himself. At this point, he glanced at Ranger. I am done arguing with results. Carefully, Jack unzipped the weatherproof bag. Inside sat copies of county land transfers, insurance claim records, handwritten notes, and something heavier beneath the stack. A thick binder labeled Red Hollow Mill Investigation. Samuel Reed's name written neatly across the front. Clara Whitmore had been right. Samuel had not stopped investigating. He had simply hidden the truth somewhere nobody would think to look. Emma flipped through several pages slowly. Her expression changed more with every document. Jack, she whispered. These dates are wrong. He looked over. Wrong how? She pointed carefully. According to official records, the mill property sat abandoned for almost 2 years after the fire. Her finger moved lower. But this says Bellamy Development bought surrounding land less than 3 months later. Silence settled heavily around them. Ranger lay quietly near Jack's feet, though his ears remained alert. Like he still expected more. Jack opened another folder. Property maps. County tax transfers. Insurance settlement paperwork. Too organized. Too fast. Samuel had circled several names repeatedly in red ink. Thomas Bellamy's father among them. County commissioner signatures. Private contractors. One handwritten note caught Jack's attention immediately. They knew before the fire. Emma looked over his shoulder. What does that mean? Jack shook his head slightly. No idea yet. Then something slid free from between the folders and landed softly on the floor. Another cassette tape, older than the others. Handwritten label faded almost beyond reading. Final recording. Ranger stood immediately. Alert again. Jack noticed something else too. The dog had stopped watching the room and started staring toward the basement stairwell instead. Listening. Emma caught it too. Did you hear that? She whispered. At first, only silence answered. Then faint movement overhead. Slow footsteps crossing somewhere near the old storage entrance. Not hurried. Measured. Somebody upstairs. Jack's expression changed instantly. Years of training rarely disappeared completely. He lowered his voice. Lights off. Emma switched off the flashlight immediately. Darkness swallowed the room except for thin gray light slipping beneath the stairwell door above. Ranger remained silent. No barking, no growling, just stillness. Listening. The footsteps paused overhead, then moved again. Slower now. Deliberate enough to feel intentional. Emma leaned closer. Could just be maintenance. Jack shook his head quietly. Nobody checks abandoned basements after dark. Minutes passed longer than they should have. Eventually, the footsteps faded. Silence returned. Ranger relaxed first, slowly lowering himself near Jack again. Calm. Safe enough. For now. Jack exhaled quietly and stood. We are not staying. Emma nodded immediately. Agreed. He slipped the documents carefully back into the weatherproof bag along with the cassette tape. Enough answers for one night. Too many questions still waiting. As they climbed back toward the street, Ranger walked slightly ahead again, occasionally glancing back to make sure they followed. Outside, evening had settled fully over Red Hollow. Storefront lights dimmed across town square while cold wind moved dead leaves across empty sidewalks. Ordinary town. Ordinary night. Yet somehow nothing looked ordinary anymore. Emma locked the storage door behind them and lowered her voice. Jack, she hesitated carefully. If Samuel was right. Her eyes moved toward the Mill Heroes Monument, standing quietly beneath streetlights nearby. Then this whole town has been living inside a lie for almost 40 years. Ranger stopped walking, turned slowly toward the monument. Then, for the first time all day, let out one quiet sound. Not fear. Not warning. Something sadder. Like remembering. The wind grew colder as night settled fully across Red Hollow, pushing dry leaves through empty sidewalks near the Mill Heroes Monument. The square looked peaceful from a distance. Quiet diner lights. Church windows glowing softly. Familiar places carrying familiar routines. Yet for Jack Mercer, nothing in town felt familiar anymore. Truth had a way of changing landscapes without moving a single building. Ranger stood beside him near the monument, still watching it with the same sadness he had shown since arriving in town. Deputy Emma Collins tucked both hands inside her jacket pockets against the cold. You should come back to the station, she said quietly. We can make copies of everything. Jack looked toward the weatherproof bag tucked carefully beneath his arm. And if somebody inside county government already knows? Emma hesitated. Honest hesitation. Then maybe not everyone should see this yet. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. Alert again. Focused. Then, without warning, he walked toward the center of town square, where workers had already begun preparing for the annual mill remembrance ceremony scheduled for the following morning. Folding chairs lined the sidewalks. Temporary lights stood waiting near the stage beside the monument. Every year the town gathered here to honor what people believed happened during the Red Hollow Mill fire. Funny thing about stories. Repeat them long enough, and even lies started sounding like memory. Ranger stopped near the base of the monument. Then he began pacing slowly around it. Once. Twice. 3 times. Careful. Intentional. Emma frowned. What is he doing? Jack watched quietly, looking for something. Ranger suddenly stopped near the rear stone foundation where decorative bricks surrounded the base. He scratched once against a narrow section partly hidden beneath fallen leaves. Then again. More urgent now. Jack crouched immediately. One brick looked slightly different from the others. Cleaner somehow. Less weathered. Recently disturbed. Emma stepped closer, shining her flashlight downward. That was not here before. Jack pressed gently against the edge. Nothing moved. Ranger nudged his hand insistently with his nose, then scratched again lower this time. Jack shifted position. Different angle. He pushed harder. A soft click echoed beneath the stone. Emma stared. No way. The narrow panel moved slightly outward. Hidden compartment. Small enough most people would never notice. Ranger stepped back calmly as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. Inside rested a sealed metal document case wrapped carefully in protective plastic. Older than the weatherproof bag from underground storage. Dust covered most of it except the handle. Somebody had hidden this intentionally. Somebody expected time to pass. Jack lifted it carefully. Heavier than expected. Ranger sat immediately beside him watching. Quiet. Patient. Like finishing mattered more than excitement. Emma looked toward the empty square nervously. We should not open that here. Jack nodded. Same instinct. Too exposed. Too visible. As they turned toward Emma's cruiser, movement near Town Hall caught Jack's attention. Mayor Thomas Bellamy stood near the courthouse steps speaking quietly with two committee volunteers. Mid-60s now. Clean coat. Perfect posture. Friendly face built from decades of shaking hands and remembering birthdays. Small-town politicians mastered warmth like second nature. Yet something about his timing felt uncomfortable. Bellamy noticed them almost immediately. His smile arrived fast. Too fast. Jack Mercer, he called warmly while walking toward them. Heard you have been getting acquainted with Red Hollow. Ranger stood instantly, calm but alert, not growling, just watching. Bellamy slowed briefly after noticing the dog. Quite the companion, he said lightly. Jack stayed polite. Found him at the shelter. Bellamy nodded. Ah yes, heard about that. His eyes drifted subtly toward the document case beneath Jack's arm. Brief glance. Easy to miss. Not for Jack. Beautiful night for remembering history, Bellamy added. Tomorrow means a lot to folks around here. Emma crossed her arms. We were just leaving. Bellamy smiled gently toward her. Of course. Then his attention returned to Jack. You know, he said calmly. Old towns survive because people learn which stories are worth reopening and which ones deserve peace. Silence followed. Wind moved softly across the square. Ranger never looked away from him. Strange thing about dogs. Sometimes they noticed what politeness tried to hide. Jack met Bellamy's eyes evenly. Truth usually survives longer than stories. Something shifted in Bellamy's expression. Tiny. Quick. Gone almost instantly. Smile returned. Well, he said softly, stepping back. Hope you enjoy the ceremony tomorrow. Then he walked away. Slow. Relaxed. Like the conversation had meant nothing at all. Emma waited until he disappeared inside town hall. That did not feel friendly, she muttered quietly. Jack looked toward the document case again. No. Ranger nudged the case once with his nose before looking back toward the monument. Not sad this time. Almost relieved. Like something important had finally been found. Later that night inside Clara Whitmore's living room, warm lamplight spilled across old photographs while rain threatened again outside the windows. Clara sat silently as Jack carefully unlocked the metal case on the coffee table. Ranger lay quietly beside him, eyes fixed on every movement. Emma stood nearby holding coffee gone cold hours ago. Slowly, Jack lifted the lid. Inside rested handwritten witness statements, official signatures, land transfer maps, and one sealed envelope marked in Samuel Reed's handwriting. Open this at the memorial if the town still chooses the lie. Silence filled the room. Outside, thunder rolled softly across distant hills. Clara whispered first. Tomorrow, she said quietly. Everything changes tomorrow. Morning arrived cold and gray over Red Hollow as church bells echoed softly through streets still wet from overnight rain. The annual Mill Remembrance Ceremony had already begun, filling town square with folding chairs, coffee stands, and familiar faces dressed in heavy coats against the October chill. Families gathered quietly beneath cloudy skies, while volunteers placed wreaths near the Mill Heroes Monument. For decades, this day had belonged to memory, to grief, to the story everyone in town believed. But standing near the courthouse steps, Jack Mercer could feel something changing beneath the surface. Truth had a way of arriving quietly before anyone noticed the ground shifting. Ranger stayed close beside him, unusually calm this morning. No pacing, no anxious focus, just quiet certainty, like the hard part had already passed. Clara Whitmore stood wrapped in a dark coat near Deputy Emma Collins, hands trembling slightly despite the warm coffee Emma had insisted she carry. Nervousness showed differently in older people. Quieter, heavier somehow. You still sure about this? Emma asked softly. Clara looked toward the monument, toward the place where silence had lived too long. No, she admitted honestly. But Samuel deserved better. Mayor Thomas Bellamy stepped onto the temporary stage moments later, greeting familiar faces with practiced warmth. The kind of smile people trusted because they had seen it for years. Thank you all for gathering, he began gently. Today we honor those we lost during one of the darkest moments in Red Hollow history. Ranger stood slowly, alert now, not tense, focused. His eyes locked on the monument immediately. Jack noticed first. The dog had not looked away once since Bellamy started speaking. Like timing mattered. Bellamy continued calmly, voice practiced and smooth. 40 years ago, brave workers gave everything during the terrible mill fire that shaped this town forever. Ranger moved suddenly. Not fast. purposeful. He stepped away from Jack and walked directly toward the base of the monument. Several people noticed immediately. Murmurs spread softly through the crowd. "Whose dog is that?" someone whispered nearby. Ranger stopped exactly where he had scratched the night before. Then he turned back toward Jack. "Waiting." Jack looked once toward Emma. She gave the smallest nod. "Go ahead." Sometimes courage arrived quietly too. Jack stepped forward through the crowd, carrying Samuel Reed's document case beneath one arm. Bellamy paused, speaking briefly, smile fading almost too quickly to notice. "Jack," he called politely. "Everything all right?" Jack stayed calm. "Depends how much people care about the truth." Silence moved across town square faster than wind. Clara lowered her eyes briefly. Emma stepped closer beside Jack. Bellamy smiled again, though it looked tighter now. "Not sure I follow." Ranger scratched once against the monument base, then sat, quiet, watching. Jack crouched near the hidden panel and carefully pressed the same loose stone from the night before. Soft clicking echoed again. Gasps spread quietly through the crowd as the hidden compartment shifted open. Emma stepped beside him and carefully removed the remaining sealed documents Samuel had left behind. Bellamy's expression changed fully now. Not anger. Concern. Controlled concern. "Deputy," he said carefully, "perhaps this is not the right place for confusion." Emma stood straighter. "Actually," she said quietly, "this might be the exact place." Jack opened Samuel's final envelope carefully. The paper inside looked old. Handwritten. Personal. Samuel's voice almost lived inside the words. Jack read aloud slowly, so everyone could hear. "If this letter is being opened, then Red Hollow still chose comfort over truth. The mill fire was not simply an accident. Property contracts had already been prepared before the fire happened. Land changed ownership too quickly afterward. Insurance money disappeared into private accounts tied to Bellamy Development and county officials." Silence deepened across town square. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emma carefully handed copies of county records to several council members standing nearby. Faces shifted quickly as signatures, dates, and land transfers lined up too clearly to ignore. Clara stepped forward then, hands shaking, voice quiet but steady. "Samuel tried to tell people," she said softly. Nobody listened. Bellamy lowered his eyes briefly. Older suddenly. Smaller somehow. "Things were complicated back then," he said carefully. "My father made mistakes." No shouting followed. No dramatic anger. Just disappointment spreading slowly through familiar faces. Sometimes heartbreak arrived quieter than expected. A few townspeople sat down again in stunned silence. Others stared toward the monument differently now, as though memory itself had changed shape. Ranger remained still beside Jack, watching the crowd calmly. Not triumphant, just tired, like carrying this truth had taken years. Emma finally spoke gently into the quiet. "County investigators will review everything." Bellamy nodded once without argument. Strange thing about truth. Eventually, resistance grew too tired to fight it. Weeks later, autumn slowly gave way to winter. Red Hollow replaced the old monument plaque with updated names and honest records. Samuel Reed's photograph finally returned to the local newspaper office, where people left flowers quietly. Clara smiled more than she had in years. Some grief softened once silence ended. Jack stayed in town longer than planned. Funny thing about purpose. Sometimes it found people when they stopped looking for it. Ranger never left his side again. One snowy morning outside the small cabin Jack eventually bought near the edge of town, the German shepherd rested peacefully near the porch while coffee steamed softly in cold mountain air. Jack looked down at him and smiled quietly. He had thought he rescued a dog nobody wanted. But perhaps Ranger had been carrying something heavier all along. Not just a secret, a promise. And maybe, after all those years, both of them had finally found their way home.